Well, John, you're running for Hillsdale County Sheriff 2016. Why don't you tell me what you think the most important problem that the Sheriff's Department has today?
One of the biggest problems we have is we've gotten so far away from the Constitution and the principles that the Constitution were founded on. Madison, who was the father of the Constitution, he taught us that you should never have the power of the sword and the power of the purse in the same hand, because that is despotism, that's tyranny. That's what we had in King George III, and that's what we fought against, is that despotism. Our founders, they didn't do this lightly. They studied all the ancient republics, and that's what we are. We're a republic. We're not a democracy. We're a republic. They studied all the ancient republics, and they studied all the writings. They studied Montesquieu, who was an authority on republics. And they realized that there had been some advancements in political science. And with that, they studied that man has a natural, self-evident truth to him, and that is, man has a natural wickedness. Man left to his own devices will do what's in his best interest and not necessarily what's in the best interest of the country or best interest of the people. So they had to try to figure out how to set their institutions up to stop that from happening, so that we would have, the first time ever in history, a government that people governed themselves. And so if we just look at the first three articles of the Constitution and how they set this up, it really kind of explains a lot of the principle. The first article of the Constitution sets up the legislative branch of government. The legislative branch of government was intended to be the largest and most powerful branch of government. And to compensate for that, they decided that that branch of government needed to be the most responsive to the people. So they had 2-year terms. The two powers that the legislative branch had was the power of the purse and the power of impeachment. So the second article of the Constitution set up our executive branch of government. The executive branch of government had less power than the legislative branch, but to compensate for that, they gave them 4-year terms. Now, the power that the executive branch had was the power of the sword. And then the third article of the Constitution set up our judiciary. Now, the judiciary was supposed to have little to no power. And to compensate for that, they gave them constitutionally guaranteed salaries and lifetime appointments in times of good behavior. One of the other reasons why they did that is they wanted them to be kind of insulated from the political winds, so that they wouldn't fall to minority or majority faction, that they would stay very true to the law, that they would serve the law and not politics. So that's kind of how we set that thing up. Everything went well. The legislative branch was very receptive to the people, very responsive to the people, all the way up to about 1913. Between 1913 and 1935, a progressive area, the progressive era, we sort of lost that whole theory. During that time, we decided that man doesn't fall under any natural, self-evident law. Man doesn't have some natural nature to him. That man is ever progressing, ever evolving, getting smarter. So those old principles, those old natural laws just didn't apply to us anymore. And during that period, what they did was they created what was called, what we call the fourth branch of government, or bureaucracy. I like to call it the litany of alphabet soup agencies. It's the
IRS?
Absolutely.
DHS, CPS,
all of those.
MDOT.
Now, some of those, the MDOT and the DHS, didn't come until later, but since we created this monster, we keep feeding it with more and more and more agencies, and we just keep building our government bigger and bigger and bigger. Now, remember, they always told us too much government is tyranny, too little government is anarchy. The right amount of government is liberty, and that's what we've lost the idea of. What we did when we created this litany of alphabet soup agencies, let's just take the IRS. That's the easy one to go for. When they set the IRS up, they gave them the power of the sword and the power of the purse in the same hand. They created this agency, and they allowed them to make regulatory law. So that's a legislative function. They got to create this law, and then they got to execute that law if they believed that someone broke that regulatory law. That's an executive branch of government function. And then we set up a study of law that we'd never had any other time in history, called administrative law. Now, see, this is important to understand, because civil law and criminal law has ties of theory that go all the way back into antiquity, all the way back to the Code of Hammurabi, the Ten Commandments, the Magna Carta of 1215, the Mayflower Compact, the Northwest Ordinance. There's a theory of law that goes all the way back into antiquity on that. Administrative law doesn't have that. We created that between 1913 and 1935. Administrative law comes down to one person's opinion. So it's tantamount to the sheep going to the wolves and saying, you know what, we don't think you should eat us. And the wolves going, well, we're going to have a hearing and we've decided we're hungry. So we're going to.
Right.
And so there's no due process there. You only have due process when you get into that constitutional law that was set up by the Constitution. So understanding that, let's just take a little scenario and understand how this thing works, where we lost our liberty.
Well, what is due process?
Well, due process is a series of checks and balances where you cannot have your rights taken from you, that we have to follow those rights, and we have to decide, and your peers have to decide whether you're guilty or not guilty based on you keeping those rights. So you have to have those rights, and those rights have to be intact for you to have due process. If that system doesn't work, if we violate your Fourth Amendment by not having probable cause, or we violate your Fifth Amendment by making you bear witness against yourself, there's no longer due process. And so we've got checks and balances in our constitutional system to make sure that those rights don't get abridged.
And so in today's world with the police officers today, we're finding that due process is kind of being thrown out the window.
Well, yes, because what they're doing is they are executing more regulatory law, more and more and more than we ever intended.
Which doesn't have due process.
No, it doesn't, because it falls under administrative law. So let's just take the IRS and take this example further, and that is the IRS comes to you and they say, we think that you fraudulently didn't pay the taxes that you should have. We believe that you committed fraud. So what we want you to do against your Fourth and Fifth Amendment right, we want you to bring all your records in so that we can form this case against you and charge you with a felony. And you go, I don't like that idea because I like the idea of having my Fourth and Fifth Amendment right. So no, I'm not going to bring that in. And they say, well, you know what? If you do that, we're only, work with us here. We'll just charge you $20,000. And you go, you know what? I'm an American. I'm going to fight this. I'm not paying a $20,000. Right. So you go, well, I'm not bringing that stuff in. They say, well, okay, then what we're going to do is we're going to execute that regulatory law that we think that you've committed.
They're going to take your business.
So we take your business and we seize your bank accounts. So with your business seized, your bank account seized, now you can't feed your family, you can't pay your bills, and you can't really defend yourself against anything because that takes money. So you go, well, no, wait a minute. I can't survive like this, so I want a hearing.
Yeah, you didn't have due process.
No due process. So you say, well, I want a hearing on this. And they say, okay, well, we're going to set this hearing up, this administrative hearing. And the administrative hearing is they are the judge and jury, the same people that are accusing you. That kind of goes against our system of government. So you go in there, you present your case, and they go, well, yeah, we've decided you owe us the money. And you go, okay, I don't like that. I'm now going to appeal this to a federal court. That's the only time you've gotten into due process now, because administrative courts are not due process. You have to be in the constitutional court, the courts that are set up by the Constitution for you to have this due process. So by the time you get there, when you get done with that administrative hearing, you're about 60 to 80 grand into this thing. You could have settled for 20 grand at the beginning, but you were going to fight it. So now you're into it for about 60, 80 grand. So now you get to a federal court, but you've already given up your Fourth and Fifth and Sixth Amendment rights. Once those are gone, in our system, if we don't assert our rights, because we're the true masters of the law, if we don't assert our rights up front, we lose our rights. So now I'm going into federal court, losing my Fourth, Fifth, and Sixth, easy. How effective do you think I'm going to be in that federal court?
Yeah, not at all.
No. So it's not very good. So by that time, I'm about 120 grand into it. If I'm a smart businessman, I'm going to think, you know what? Why didn't I just pay the $20,000 and save the $100,000? Right. It would have been a whole lot better. So this is where they get you. So what happens now? Well, these bureaucracies steal all this money off the backs of the people through this extortion and regulatory law that was never intended by our founders.
Right.
And we take that money, and now here's another natural principle, another natural law that takes place. And Benjamin Franklin articulated it well when he said, there will always be a proponent of the people to give more to the prince for what the prince can give back to them. This is where this theory comes in, because these bureaucracies that pull all this money, steal this money off the backs of the people, they put it back into the political process. Now remember when we talked about that first article of the Constitution setting up the legislative branch of government, because it was so big and so powerful, it had to be responsive to the people, and that's why they gave it short terms. 2 years. Well, from the inception of the Constitution until 1913, we never saw congressmen and senators in their 20, 30, 40 years. They were responsive to the people because through natural law, they stayed true to those short terms. But now when you've got this fourth branch of government putting into that system, giving to the prince for what the prince can give back to them to make sure that they stay in power, right? Because it takes an act of the legislature to limit the power of the IRS or the CDC or DHS or any of those other regulatory agencies. So what we do is we keep those people in there, and we always make sure that we keep the people in there that will always give back, right? So this is where we went wrong. So, we have to understand natural law, and we have to go back to those principles that were there. Now there's another natural law that's happening in our sheriff's department, and we need to get specific to that because that's what I'm running for. Now that we understand that principle that our country was founded on, now let's apply that learning to our county. We've got a county sheriff's department that has had unbridled power for so long.
Right.
And one of the self-evident truths are that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And it corrupts them to such a level, so slowly and so delicately, that they don't even realize that they've become corrupt.
Exactly. They their friends love them. Their
Sure.
family don't recognize the corruption.
Sure. And when people talk to him, they don't see horns and a tail on him. They go, "Well, he's a nice guy. She's a nice lady," and that's true. Those people are, but they do some of the most heinous things. Like we've got people that are going to prison for 19 months that never had probable cause. They didn't have probable cause to write an arrest warrant. They didn't have probable cause to go to that person's job and have them fired because they were on the SOR so that I could write the arrest warrant. But see, these things are happening. Now, that person didn't see that as a bad thing. They're thinking, you know what, my job's to protect the public. I'm going to go protect those people and tell them what a piece of scum this guy is. But that's not within our system. That's not a good thing. Most people standing on the outside would go, that's horrible. Why would you ever do something like that?
We view it as they're above the law.
That's right. Because why? Because I execute the law. So thereby, I'm above the law. So I'm not doing anything wrong. I'm not doing bad things. But see, it's that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So I'm a human being. What makes anybody think that I'm some superhuman, that I'm going to be above that corruption? I'm not. I'm a human being. So if I have that kind of power, at some level, I will become corrupt. Well, how do I protect against that? Well, I have to understand those self-evident truths and understand that natural law, and I have to set something in place to keep that from happening. That's why I think it's so important that after I'm sworn in as sheriff, one of the very first things I want to do is I want to start a Citizens Advisory Council. Now, that's not for the citizens, 17 citizens from one from each township in Hillsdale County, for the citizens to make the decisions. No, I'm the sheriff. I make the decisions. I have to do that. We learned that through medicine, that we have to have one executive head in that executive branch of government that makes that decision. We can't have a council. And that Citizens Advisory Council is not a council to make decisions. The Citizens Advisory Council is there to set in judgment of the decisions I make.
Right, and we don't have that today.
No, we don't.
In fact, I don't think we have that anywhere in the state.
Well, we do, but every 4 years. And the Sheriff's Department is supposed to be transparent, but we found that our county government isn't transparent. and our county sheriff isn't transparent. I mean, we've had a $100,000 payout through the county. We've had a $40,000 payout through the county.
We got a big lawsuit right now.
We got a big lawsuit right now.
We got more coming down.
That's right. We've got all these things being paid out and being kept quiet.
Yeah, city members knowing about it, not telling the public.
Exactly. So how it's broken, and it's broken at the sheriff's department, and it's broken in a lot of the different branches of government in our small little town. So I think this is the important thing, is the sheriff has the most power of any other elected official in our county. He's got a very small area, but he's got a lot of power. He's the only elected law enforcement, and thereby he outranks all other law enforcement that is appointed.
Like IRS.
Michigan
State
they're not really
Police.
law enforcement, but Michigan State Police, FBI, DEA.
Executive branch office.
That's right. So he's got more power. He doesn't answer to those people. He answers directly to the people. The Citizens Advisory Council will make sure that he answers directly to the people every day, not just every 4 years.
This is on day one.
On day one. Why is that important? Because I understand I'm a human being. I understand that I'm susceptible to corruption. How can I stop that? This is the main way to stop that. And this will make my administration far more transparent and give the people far more control over the power of the sheriff's department. They're not there to make the decisions. The buck stops here. The buck stops with me. I will make the decision, but I will be judged by 17 people for those decisions.
Or your
I make.
deputies.
Sure, if my deputies have a problem with me, then they can go to that Citizens Advisory Council and make a complaint on me.
Or the citizens have a problem with the deputy.
That's right. If the citizens have a problem with the deputy, then they can go to that person from there.
Who do you go to today?
Well, let's see. You go to the wolves and tell the wolves that you've got a problem with the wolves, and they have an investigation and decide that the wolves were just fine. They were hungry, so they're going to eat the sheep.
So they're complacent to the fraternity, is what you're saying.
Exactly. And that's why I am the best choice for sheriff of Hillsdale County.